pretty much everywhere where the demonstrations, the labor demonstrations had taken place. In Chicago, there were 3 days of rioting that left 18 people dead. And then the trade unions movement in Chicago called a general strike that shut down the entire city. President Hayes's response to this was to rush in federal troops who were fighting Native Americans in the Great Plains to occupy the city of Chicago. As President Hayes applied more military force in order to restore civil peace on terms that most workers viewed as preferential to the railroad companies, the protests continued to spread into virtually every town where there was a railroad junction. Train traffic across the country was stopped and remained stopped for 2 full weeks. In San Francisco, the demonstrations took on an anti-Chinese turn, and the demonstrators attacked businesses that employed Chinese workers. And when there were fires started, when the firemen came to put out the fires, the striking workers shot at the firemen, and there was a pitched battle on what is used to be Rincon Hill. It's down in the south of Market near the Embarcadero. The hill was raised at some time ago, and a dozen men were killed, and martial law was declared in San Francisco to try to restore order. So in one of the rare photographs that we have. At the end of it, railroad companies lost more than $30 million in property destroyed, and they lost business, roughly equivalent to about $6 billion in today's money. So it was quite a significant event just from a business point of view. And it was with this event, the National Rail Strike, that the labor question became on the top of everyone's list of what had to be addressed if the country was to avoid drifting into chaos again. It became an issue of immediate concern. Why were working men, their wives, and the shopkeepers with whom they traded so ready to fight against the power of corporate property? And labor unrest continued on a regular basis through the 1930s, and strikes continued to turn violent, though none were as violent as the railroad strike of 1877, which remained, however, in everybody's memory as this searing event, something equivalent to the Watts riots of 1965 or the Los Angeles riots of 1992. So, let's see. Okay, so why was violence so endemic in labor-capital relations? One reason, and it's a simple reason, was the ease with which owners prevailed upon government to use police or military power to enforce what they considered to be their property rights. If one level of government was not cooperative, and this was as often happened when municipal elections led to mayors and city councils that were sympathetic to labor, corporate leaders moved up the ladder to the state government and, if necessary, to the federal government to get aid in suppressing strikes. So corporate leaders had a broader menu of assistance that they could turn to than workers did. Another source of the violence was the involvement of private security forces employed by corporations, and who were completely independent of government oversight. Business owners generally took the position that weakness during strikes would only encourage more trouble, and workers had to be handled roughly, either to force them back or increasingly to fire everybody when there was a strike and then just bring in a new group of workers. And equally important, not to be dismissed, strikes turned violent because workers themselves were angry, and they were ready to fight for the defense of living standards and for control over their lives. So if for workers, employees of industrial firms, the Industrial Revolution meant a profound change in their relationship with their employer. A profound change that really took steam during and after the Civil War as industrial corporations grew in scope. And as the growing demand for railroads and the production of heavier agricultural machinery encouraged investors and engineers to figure out how to produce more and more quickly. Before 1870, most industrial plants were small, and typically factories were owned by a family whose members were personally involved in production. So George Westinghouse's father worked alongside his employees manufacturing the metal products that his firm produced. Then as industry grew and the profits from industry became more attractive, financial companies, some American, some Dutch, some English, started looking for successful firms and bought them. We now think of this as perfectly normal. If a startup company in Silicon Valley has a promise of success, some big company is going to come in and buy it. But in the 1870s, this was actually something quite new that people didn't quite understand what it was happening, why it was happening, or what it would mean. So if you were a worker, it meant that your relationship to your employer changed dramatically. For example, in the 1850s and 1860s in the city of Scranton, Pennsylvania, where the office, the U.S. version of the office, is set, the two leading industrialists in Scranton were George Scranton and Thomas Dixon. And on the left, you see George Scranton's iron foundry, as it was when he was actually running it. George Scranton worked on the shop floor. He wielded his hammer and chisel as he developed new methods for manufacturing iron. A worker for the Dixon plant recalled that Thomas Dixon showed up on the shop floor every morning in his blue denim trousers and a worker's blouse. Quote, "He took the hammer from one man and took his place for about 15 minutes, then stepped over to the other side and spelled another man for 15 minutes. Now, there were conflicts between Scranton and his workers and between Dixon and his workers, and both firms had had strikes by their workers who wanted more money or reduced hours or both. But union leaders felt that the interests of the two sides were largely in harmony. Disputes were typically resolved before they went to the strike stage by personal negotiation with the employers, who knew pretty much all of the men working for them on a first-name basis. They knew the names of their wives, they knew the names of their children. If their sons were particularly bright, they paid for their sons to go to high school and college. They took care of emergency expenses that a worker and his family might have. But then in 1877, a New York City firm bought out the Scranton Company. Scranton and his family made a lot of money. They moved to Philadelphia, where they bought a very nice fancy house on Rittenhouse Square, at that time, the most exclusive residential neighborhood in the country. When the first set of disputes developed, a delegation of workers decided to travel to New York City to meet with the president of the corporation who had bought out the Scranton Iron Foundry. The firm called the police to have the delegation ejected from the building. They had, in fact, written a letter announcing they were coming, so the police were waiting for them. What workers saw as a good faith effort to resolve problems on a face-to-face, man-to-man basis was interpreted by the new owners as an unlawful attempt to intimidate them, to browbeat them, to threaten them. So strikes in Scranton became particularly violent, and the new company soon sought to dismiss all the workers who had been there and replace them with immigrant workers they had contracted for in Europe and paid for them to be transported over to the United States, which led to even more violence in Scranton, Pennsylvania, when the European replacement workers arrived. The community in Scranton was largely hostile to the new owners. They were supportive of the trade unions, which after all consisted of local men and their families, people that they knew, whereas they didn't know the owners in New York City either. And so the city police provided very little help to owners in asserting their understanding of their property rights. So the corporation then had to rely on private police services like the Pinkertons, who tended to be much more violent than either the police or the military. So that also escalated. Both sides were angry. Both sides misread each other, we could say. But we might also think of this as two very different ways of thinking about how business and personal life should intersect at coming into conflict. The corporate style and the family-based personal style, were like two completely opposing languages of being spoken at each other. The local support for the workers was actually a common situation, but the discovery of anthracite coal in the early 1870s helped change the location of industrial production. This new type of coal was very efficient, and coal-driven steam power was a lot cheaper than water power, and this allowed for greater flexibility in the placement of industry. After 1880, the majority of new industrial plants were placed within the city boundaries of the largest East Coast and Midwest cities. Local governments were more supportive of corporate power and freely volunteered their police forces to combat strikes. Now, factories in places like Scranton did not disappear. It's just that they were not built up to the same degree. And Scranton remained a smallish town, whereas a place like Cleveland grew immensely. And immigrants poured into the cities and provided a cheaper source of unskilled and semi-skilled labor.